Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval trumpeters between the 11th and the 13th century. As a military history video essentially, it came out this randomly today, and you would think, how much is there to say really about medieval trumpeters, also in a military historical context, but actually there would be a lot to tell. Anybody who knows, for example, the importance of acoustic signals in battle realizes, what's actually can expect even easily, historically speaking, to understand how much there is out there about every single quote you could say. But more than that, and this is the importance, I would say, that I discovered gradually, or even of these apparently secondary aspects, is actually a lot of anthropological contents to it. Right. Today we will take a look to essentially these 3 centuries, say between 1066 and 1300 fundamentally, because we also sectioned the thing like that. But for example, I started, I think, at the very beginning of this year to make videos about, in fact, military musical instruments. There is a video we made especially about Islamic military music during the Middle Ages that was actually freaking amazing. I had never read about that, but the things you can draw from that in cultural and anthropological terms are utterly amazing. About entire cultures that were naturally also overlapping with the Western ones that we discussed today, and that are often, in fact, treated. This is the impression I received, as if there's always this dichotomy that the West was somewhat more, rational, and the East more emotional in some way. This is a bit of stereotype of exoticism of the Orient, right? That we often come up with it, if anything, maybe not just even on purpose, but this sense that objectively there were some such deep, important differences, such divides, right? And there is some truth to that, right? I don't want to sound like a myth buster saying, oh, it's not true, you can't generalize about this. I do believe that there is something, the Western perspective that in fact influences these aspects, as we will see today. But also there is a lot, actually, that we attribute as, in fact, non-modern or non-secular, right? About these other cultures that technically at the time did exist in the West, that we have erased in many ways in this, in fact, since the Enlightenment onwards, right? Trying to exercise, in fact, or to secularize certain aspects of medieval culture, and generally speaking, cultures like these all around the world, with the excuse that eventually in the West we naturally evolved towards a much more aseptic, analytical, rationalizing point of view. And this is actually not a very good approach to understand the deeper veins of those cultures and those reality of the past, right? Because we emerge from a reality that is by far, even today, all but rational, not even close to even, more rational than irrational. And secondly, that still leaves, within us from those times. We have dealt a lot now with this perspective. Just the other day we made that video. What was about? It was about the evangelization of Europe. Technically was a military themed topic, but it extended on other, say, more civil aspects. But it was properly part of that series on medieval chivalry, and this picture that we are outlining relatively to the roots of what we call chivalry, right? And in fact, in a rationalizing sense, I've been asked sometimes, especially at the beginning, before I expanded these topics, from certain users who are eventually fascinated with the Middle Ages and and chivalry and knighthood and so on. Where did this thing come from? Was it something we borrowed from the East, the cataphracts? Was it? There's this perspective we always criticize in Schwerpunkt that is properly mechanistic and in fact related to the idea that cultures were sectorially separated, and that one had essentially to take from one other to graft into itself in order to have. This is not how things really work. And let me tell you that especially warfare is the most powerful hybridizers of cultures and civilizations, that among at least one of the greatest hybridizers in this regard, that is very useful, especially for pre-industrial times, to observe also naturally in the shades of this and in a relatively actually homogeneous picture. Right? And you think of all this introduction for getting to one point it is, you think of medieval trumpet here, the average modern mind says, what about the trumpet? This is a video about an instrument, right? About how it played, maybe mechanically, maybe something archaeological. I personally don't give a damn about that. It can't be even interesting indeed. I have no doubt about that. I would be even interested to know more about it, of course. But the point is, what was the trumpet like, integrated like into this broader system from a political, military, and social point of view, in the Clausewitzian trinitary fashion, let's say. What is that a trumpet that really embodied with its sound, with its in its function, rather than the more mechanic aspects of it, right? Because we know, and if you look at that video on medieval Islamic music, military music, by the way, you realize how devastatingly spiritual the whole issue is, and how objectively, also in the West, some importance was attached to it, right? Think about the value of music, historically speaking, from the Neo-Pythagorean and Neoplatonic tradition, eventually collected by St. Augustine and studied throughout all the early Middle Ages, and that by the 12th also giving rise to probably the Gothic cathedrals, right? Gothic cathedrals were not built because someone found Vitruvius. They were built because someone began to study more attemptably a musical treaty, right, of the 4th century AD. Thinking about the proportions of music, the language of it, the perfection of the divine design. This is something that we get also up to Bach, for example. Many are, throughout all, as you understand here, a moment of our history, Western history, that is deeply soaked into this, what we call today as Ancien Régime values, because once again, it's the Enlightenment that eventually stigmatized this reality as something, somewhat barbaric or dark or extraneous to our world. It's instead one of the most colorful, beautiful pictures you can even imagine, right? Aside from the sheer brutality and extreme violence of these worlds, that really we don't have anything to envy to, in the sense that things have not changed dramatically. But can you think of the spectacle, not just visual? Because once again, even in here, modernistically speaking, we're fixated with movies and the visual side of the story, movies and video games, right? What is entertainment about? The vision, not making your brain function or making you feel something in terms of something deeper articulated. A medieval battle being one of the most beautiful sights ever to be seen. Colors, sounds, these concerted maneuvers, this great coordination that actually existed, right? We have went past very far from quite a time now. The idea that the medieval military art didn't exist, it was rough, there was no order, no rationale in that, right? Medieval warfare is one of the most brutally cold, rational warfare, like warfare is in general throughout all the historical path you can ever imagine, right? And we observe it naturally, video after video, on the dedicated topics of military history. And I think we should recover in this regard also the meaning of what can seem as banal as a musical instrument that was actually connected to millenary traditions of experience that already by the Middle Ages indeed were secularized compared to the previous centuries, but that made actually of a battle, right, a spiritual experience, right? There is all a branch. I don't know how much it is studied because I've read a very few books about the topic, and it would be interesting to expand that. But probably the anthropology of, let's say, the mystics of warfare, proper. That is to say, how have men brought themselves to, historically speaking, into the the counter-instinctual thing you can ever imagine, that is war, right? Every person you meet that tells you that war is inhuman or irrational or barbaric is probably one of the most radically ignorant people you can ever meet in your life. Secondly, how, in fact, can humans convince themselves, inspire themselves to get into something that definitely is what all politics and society eventually revolves around, especially in these centuries, and that needs an enormity of moral forces, as we have very well and at length seen in the von Clausewitz series. What does this mean? Well, it means that if you had gone back, I don't know, think about Celtic warfare, we talked a bit about that. Think about the Carnics, right? But you can look at, we'll see with the Bucina today, medieval times. I mean, it's something that comes back from the Roman past, right? These were, throughout all the battlefields of antiquity in this regard, essentially not just musical instruments, right? In the Carnics, right, with those semblances, with that appearance, with those forms of usually animals, right? This sacred animals, in fact, that were meant actually to all together with songs, not just shouts as we imagined them sometimes, once again, because of the secularization of the barbarians were just a bunch of irrational brutes and so on. No, but those were songs. Think about the bards. Think about, imagine after a battle between the Roman legions and Germanic tribes. You could imagine after in the aftermath of this utter violence of corpses all over the places at the outskirts of these forests in Central Europe, etc. You would have seen coming in the darkness of the evening all these singers that would come to sing the passage, right, the other side of all the fallen warriors, right, and singing the deeds of these men, of these warriors, and the clans where they coming from, the blessing of the deity of war to which these people had bound and sworn allegiance and sacrificed themselves. And all these songs, all these actions were actually concerted in a, what I never deny to define a religious military perspective that objectively before the nation state was the exclusive foundation of every single political and social institution, right? There's nothing properly before the nation state that has ruined a lot of things. Other things had done it, right, if anything for a pragmatical reason, but objectively we have lost this perception about the true, let's say, capacity to spur the human mind to do things that evidently, without a state, was difficult to enforce to people. Right, bringing someone, even in the Middle Ages, during feudal times, bringing all people that were bound by very different relations, where there was no centralistic power properly meant, to die all together on a battlefield. Right, and to make it a matter, an existential matter, because these people, let's see today, still in this low medieval times now, objectively lived for that and that only. Right, what was best for you according to in the life of a knight that would fight as a knight throughout all his life. Like, there was not properly a moment in which he just started doing something else. An average knight would have died in his own diarrhea in a ditch, with a rotten limb or something during a siege, and would have rotten away, probably on the spot, right? What is the greatest dream of a knight? To die in a pitched battle, right, in the front line, with his with his ensigns, with his blason, that we will see, in fact, is connected to the musical side of the story, right? Medieval heraldry is deeply connected to this musical tradition of chants, right? War cries and so on, because that's exactly where the term actually comes from, right? So eventually, heraldry is a bit, aside, of course, from its, still naturalistic, if you want, zoological, partly anthropomorphic, of course, symbology, was still essentially a functional secularization of a much deeper meaning that already at that point was being actually standardized by the symbol, right? And that was actually something way more complicated just a few centuries before, right? And even here, there's a lot to connect with the individuality of the warrior, the extension instead of, the various political and social connections. There is way more than we usually made. And still during these centuries, in the heart of the Middle Ages, still the song, the music, was considered, objectively, as we've seen before, something spiritual, something magic in many ways, something that was trying to read the highest truths of the creation, properly meant. This is properly the picture that we want to give, right? And always bearing in mind, naturally, that musical instruments were normal in many ways in these contexts, and there was properly no boundary between those Eurasian steppe cultures, for example, but also Middle Eastern or Arab traditions that had actually millenary musical traditions. Objectively, yes, more than in the West, and from which actually also modern, all over the world, let's say, all the various world militaries that are organized from the 19th century onwards, according to, naturally, to the Western model, but a Western model had taken during the Middle Ages, the modern age, actually a lot of these musical traditions of bands, of playing of true instruments, properly from the Islamic world and the Crusades and that meeting, right? But even in here, we shouldn't, the attitude is saying, you see, that's the kind of Eastern thing that we got, right? But we had our own things in turn that probably were less developed. I have my own, hypothesis of why this could have been the case. We will see now a bit the difference, very, very concisely about the, Western and Eastern musical tradition. But properly, I think that, let's say the Middle Eastern, because it was properly Middle Eastern, right? Even the Near East, North Africa, got it from the Persian world. There's many aspects actually of also Islamic civilization at the end of the day, because Persia was properly a civilization. The Arabs at the beginning, at least those that led the Islamic invasions, were coming from tribes, right? So it's not that they had developed an enormous deal on their own. But think about the same Parthians. We know it, for instance, Roman times, they had this terrifying ways of presenting themselves on the field using music, right? And I suspect a lot of this has actually to do with Iranian dualism, right? It is something that we actually share as properly as Indo-Europeans also in the West, from the Indo-Iranian war, whatever you want to call it, in fact, of the steppes, right, of the, think about the Scythians, the Sarmatians, and so on, all these other peoples, that had to do properly with the, the transcendental relation between the music, the spirit, the light, actually, right, and through the St. Augustine, the Neoplatonic tradition, we got that. It's the same thing you find in the Gothic cathedrals from another channel. And this Apollinic, if you want, even in the Hellenistic tradition, symbolism, that was deeply connected to, surprise, surprise, cavalry and trumpets, right? And specifically that, and there are even their reasons. Like the sound of the trumpet is more immediate, it's more penetrating, it's immediate, it gives you the speed of cavalry, of all these worlds, of these Reitervölker, we could say, that came from Eurasia. And that, in fact, we made a video actually on trumpets and drums, something like that, on anthropology of discipline. That a video is that deals actually with the modern age. It talks about specifically the use of music for training and discipline reasons on the battlefields, right? And in there we talk about this, about the separation, the split between the Apollinic and the Dionysiac in many ways. The idea that the trumpet is for cavalry, the drum is for the infantry, right? And in the Middle Ages, this distinction was very strong, was still there, right? The idea that the knight was a sort of superior being, right? It was a proto-racial discrimination, actually, in the idea of noble blood over the peasantry, right? Always considered this absolutely, this myth that discrimination began actually with the nation state is very wrong. Like, nation state gave it a pseudo-scientific character to it. It invented racism improperly, as we know it, unfortunately, and so on. But the idea that the previous world was devoid of that is also one of the grossest forms of ignorance, but also of naivety proper, right? The pre-industrial world was brutally discriminatory at every single level of its own society. Throw to the bin all those ideas that, I don't know, things like, I don't know, the Roman Empire was, there was no discrimination. That's absolutely wrong, right? It's actually pretty evident for anybody who has ever read classical sources in his own life. But we will not be talking about this now. But just remember that also, never to idealize, like, to the Middle Ages, as unfortunately there are a lot of people out there who think that the Middle Ages was just a black hole of obscurantism and backwardness, and we just spent an instant of silence for those people's brains. But also there are, unfortunately, less but more fanatic, zealotic people that believe that the Middle Ages is this moment of purity, of great happiness and justice and balance, because naturally they cannot give a context proper to and an objective judgment to what we know, and that sources tell us at every single time about this. In fact, about these societies were nightmarish, right? Nobody would, with a sensible mind, would think that it would be better to live in those times compared to today's, higher, Western standards, at least, right? Surely there were moments of the Middle Ages are much better than to live in that in some places in the world today. There's no doubt about this, but the point is that do not idealize history. Do not think that you're owed something by the past, because the past actually doesn't give a freaking damn about you in terms of what you may pretend to think about it, right? Once that it has already happened. But properly, this separation we're talking about between the conqueror on horseback, right? That was mercilessly the conqueror that fed itself of his own divine right to crush whoever was conquered. We're talking about wars like these that survived also in the, albeit more disciplined, bit more, in a milder form thanks to Christianization and certain aspects of it, but that in the practice of the feudal reality, you would think what those lords actually thought about their peasants, right? And that is not even to say that it was like an exploitatory thing only, because of course a lord knew pretty damn well what was the worth of a peasant, right? He cared extremely about his peasants, also because they were the most, the most prevalent source of revenue in that regard. So even in here we have to be very concrete and objective to try to do it. But properly, the idea that who fights on horseback is superior, essentially, intrinsically, morally, and militarily, of course, than who fights on foot, right? The Indo-European solar, Apollinic ideal of the deity of war that rules over earth, that comes from the sky, from on horseback, right, and crushes the chthonic deities of the conquered peoples of the agrarian sedentary realities, right, that live underground and escape underground at the moment of the conquest, right? It's something that is still alive in the Middle Ages. These guys didn't know that properly, but they surely knew things. I mean, they didn't rationalize it like we do anthropologically now, but they felt that. They felt that in a sound there was something divine, that the sound of the trumpet was a prerogative, right? The medieval and feudal hierarchy was extremely careful about this. Not everybody could have that amount, for example, of musical instruments. We've seen it actually in Islamic military music. That was an enormous deal in Islam. And to close the circle, what I was saying before is that I think in the West we had less of this reality that, as we've seen, however, did exist, because in the East, in the Islamic world that was prevalent naturally at this time, in spite of all, of course, the massive pagan relics that, of course, has existed in the same way as it existed in Christianity, and it probably derived from this Indo-Iranian dualism of, the music, the light against the matter, the darkness as such, was the fact that in Islam you cannot represent living forms, right? It's forbidden. Just like in Judaism, you cannot represent humans, you cannot represent God, of course. Of course, local art, made a lot of exceptions in many ways. There is beautiful Islamic art, represents a lot of animals, vegetation, all this stuff. But objectively, my opinion in this regard is that first, the Persian tradition that was very close to the spring of the Indo-Iranian dualism had sublimated, had remained, let's say, very, very close to the sublimation of the pure amateriality of the glory of the military glory of the sky, and that Islam basically adopted this and once again sublimated God's greatness through this immaterial show. In other ways, the least, this was a principle that you find even, in the Alexandrine legacy in many ways. I mean, the idea that you have to conquer without even drawing out the sword, right? This idea that it's the spirit that descends from the sky and crushes the enemy just with a sigh. I found, you may actually not believe it, but this mentality survives in those countries. Like, I've seen it from some comments on Schwerpunkt from a lot of Muslim followers that I have, that objectively tend to reason in this kind of a transcendental dichotomy, whereas a Westerner reason in terms of, in a desacralizing way. I don't know how to say that, but it's all matter, it's all mechanics, it's just numbers. We have forgotten in Clausewitzian terms, and that's the heart of the West in many ways, the moral forces and the effect that even a musical instrument can make on the spiritual chords of a person that is going on the battlefield to kill or get killed. Right? It's not going there to pick flowers. It's going to rip other human beings apart alive, right? And I hope, actually, you don't understand what this means, right? I don't. Some military man understands this, but in practice, what that experience overall 1,000 years ago could have been, well, that nobody can know, right? We can try to understand it better, but the ways these guys functionalized it actually is something that goes far beyond our understanding, but through which we can see all these fil rouge that connects the dawn of times in many ways, and historical, I don't know even when music came about, but in general that it's something existentially connected to human experience, right? For all even in there the mechanical reasons, you can't secularize the story. It's not that you have to buy the necessarily the religious side of it, but still you have to understand it. I feel very embarrassed for those people that sometimes come up and say, I don't understand why should I study theology for knowing history. Well, because you wouldn't understand anything about the civilizations you study otherwise. That's a good reason, for example, for studying this stuff. And I frankly don't know any university where you study medieval history and there's kind of no understanding in religious studies whatsoever, because independently from whether they are connected to Christianity, to monotheism, it can be you must study what history of religion has been since the beginning of humanity, because if you don't understand that properly, do another job, right? That's what we have been told, and objectively it is true, right? Or at least you lose an enormous part of it, and you keep persisting in the very old now historiographical mistakes that have been debunked exactly on the base of such realization, right? That we should not definitely abandon our rationale and our analytical skills, but we should also let the chords of our feelings speak for what we can recognize actually in these past that is much closer to us than we can imagine, right? Because these were universal languages in many ways. This is true all over the world. It's not just about Christianity or Islam or these areas of Eurasia or North Africa. It's true for everywhere, right? So trumpets naturally were just one of the instruments that were used on the battlefield. We focus on them because in many ways, I suspect, because of the same preeminence of cavalry properly meant, right? They were used in most armies. We know it from Merovingian times, were there. They were taken from the Roman armies as well. It was there already. It was used really, if not in every army, virtually, but let's say at least in most of them, considered that these instruments naturally came from, they were not brought up just when there was war, right? These were, think about religious festivals, think about, I don't know, things like processions, important events, were there, right? Normally in these societies, they were somewhat always included. In fact, I must say there is, like towards late medieval times, there is this idea, you find it in some workamistic works, that that the Ottomans brought a freaking lot, much of that musical instruments injection of military musical culture we're talking about before coming from the Islamic world in the West was brought during the Ottoman Wars in the late medieval, in the early modern and beyond actually times, more than during the Crusades actually, but seemingly a lot came from there as well. But properly in Western armies, there was already a lot of this stuff. The Ottomans were famous because they had from very early times, properly specific military bands, very well regulated and so on. But the Ottomans didn't exist before the late 13th century. If you look at these medieval armies in Europe, they already had their own tambourines, their own trumpets. That is something that naturally, as we saw in that video on the trumpets and drums, increased together with discipline, with centralization. But naturally, just think about the difference between a 14th and 15th century European army, right? Think about Switzerland specifically. That, in fact, was famous for the first tambourines and these elements. Why? Because by the mid 15th century, we're the first guys who had enough collective training to make thousands of pikemen work all together on the field, right? Up to 1 century before, the Swiss militias were just, a bunch of they had the Vosges more than the halberd, but they were halberdiers, fewer pikemen, and they didn't have that offensive capability that would characterize them later. And it's obvious that in order to have this intensive training and maintaining cohesion, they needed a pace, right? A rhythm, a frequency, and therefore this went on. The more armies grew in the modern age, the more that they became disciplined and they could perform complex maneuvers. Music was fundamental to listen to that. If you wonder, for example, if you look at Roman times, where also the disciplinary standards were very high, the ones of collective training a lot. If you wonder these huge gaps in the helmets sides for ears were about, well, that tells you how important it was to receive orders over the same protection of your ear, by the way. That all around the edge was very well reinforced for that very reason, but for making you understand the importance of coordination that these signs could give, right? Because a battlefield is a devastating experience, also sensorially speaking, so you must stay, let's say, awake, conscious, in a rational sense, as much as you can if you want to come out alive from there. The same goes actually for medieval warfare, where there wasn't an extremely high level of collective training except for the elites, for the cavalry elites, and therefore trumpets, as we've seen, were connected to this immediate, bright, direct, penetrating sound that suggested, that the charge, the immediate attack of cavalry were very important in this sense, because a knight spent, all his life training, right? Whether it was by, in peacetime, during the bad season, or in wartime, and during the good season, it was exactly the same thing. So an extremely high level of individual professionalism that starts being coupled with the development of chivalry, with an increasing, very, very high actually, level of collective training in that regard. Not as much as you could find, in Mongol armies in that sense. That is showed dramatically by the clashes between the Westerners and the Mongols in the 13th century. But still a big deal for looking at what instruments they sounded, saying, you know what, that is probably what was dramatically important for them, considering the sense that there are other counter-arguments, such as, for example, that by the 13th century, famously, the knight's helm gets completely closed. So it was usually the squires that ran back and forth, telling, just to the gunner in a modern tank, look left, look right, from the commanding post, because they couldn't properly see. The eye slits were very thin. The guys they had a very limited vision and perception of the surrounding thing. Padded armor underneath, inside the helmet. It was a very complex business, very apparently machinous one, but it did work, and it did work thanks also to this great coordination that, after all, did exist. Right? It is true that there was a degree of disgregation sometimes of the line unit in at some levels during the fight, with this individual say small unit tactics of the various companies or squads that made up the line, but still the point is that there was a great connection between the various knights that practiced, in this sense, exclusively for combat in that function, were organized also, were trained also with this science, with these trumpets and so on. And much more than that, right, too, a broader collective need. Trumpets were usually employed to transmit the orders to break camp, to prepare for battle, to commence attack, to rally, and so on, right? In those situations where amphibious warfare, getting on the boats, think about the Scandinavians that, the Viking era ends, but they keep doing exactly the same thing they did before this through the Lighting system, in more concerted ways, for which, of course, this broader organization was needed. The trumpet signals were usually emitted as a series of one or more blasts. Right, I don't think they were particularly sophisticated instruments after all, and they didn't need to be in this sense. And they were normally used, like any other time of military history, with visual signals, right, with flag movements. Usually look at the statutes of the Templars and how, by the 13th century, how sophisticated actually cavalry tactics were, and how dramatic the whole thing of the banners at the center of the wall knight's vision, because that's a rally point. And think about, as we were saying before, what a battlefield could be between the dust, the smoke, the reduced sight, pain, shouts, blood, all we can imagine in this sense. And usually, naturally, there was all a forms of coordination that unfortunately are lost, right? There's not a big deal of manuals, actually, if not at all, I think, for this period. That's something that starts happening towards later Middle Ages. So there were a lot of conventions in the practice of warfare that we don't really know. Of course, all these trumpets and flags interaction were, known. They were fairly sophisticated. We can't think all together, right? But they had to be also very clear, very, very precise. So they usually indicated, for example, the direction of the attack, as well as giving the order to halt, right? Also, the flags especially served as a rallying point, as we were saying before. what were trumpeters about? Because we will not talk perhaps a lot about them specifically, who they were. We will look at the figure of the Jongleur. That is something slightly different, and actually is the reminiscence of the bards and these figures that actually had properly a military value on their own, right? By the later Middle Ages, it's obvious that the trumpeters and musicians in general on the battlefield had no military, they didn't participate to the fight, right? They had no part in combat proper. But the thing might have been different before. Think even just about the use of horns. Think about Roland, that was the commander of the rear guard of Charlemagne's army, right? And even in there were signals properly. The commander had to give, right? And by Carolingian times, we're talking about very archaic times in which, communication on the battlefield didn't have all of these sophistication of the bands of other, specific specialized personnel, but just it was the commander maybe did the whole thing. Even horns have this dramatic meaning, cultural meaning, as you well know, in the history of folklore, etc. But of course, a normal trumpeter in the low Middle Ages could be armored, right? They usually stayed, at least some of them, close eventually to the commander. It could be the king, it could be the higher nobleman. So with his bodyguard, and with, therefore, the guy said, give this order, these guys had to be next to him and sound, right? So chances are that they were also kind of not such a dramatically low status, right? This could be true for other figures that accompanied the various companies, right? And think about the communal militias, and these were, everyday people. Maybe there was simply, someone who lived as a musician in the civil business and did that, on the field, right? There's nothing strange about it, actually. And always consider that naturally, especially in this century, still the practice of warfare, the idea of how to use a weapon, that was still, very, was still widespread, right? Of course, the masses of peasants were allegedly, disarmed, right? But in practice, we know that there was a practicality. That people knew how to handle a weapon, just unprofessionally, of course, not like a knight, but still in an effective way, right? So what we see actually from the passage between from towards the late Middle Ages is that there is a kind of a demilitarization of the figure, even of the musicians in some way, because of the growth of the centralization of the state, of the hierarchies, all the ranks, and so on. But of course, these guys could be armored. We know, for example, from the Matthew Paris mid-13th century manuscript that this was the case, right? There is really nothing strange about that. There were musicians properly also close to standard bearers, so people who had to be in the front line unavoidably, that had to give a minimum of pace even during the advance, because these things actually happened, right? It wasn't usually, especially the militias, the infantry, in this time didn't advance to attack. They usually advanced to eventually stop and take the enemy charge passively, right, in a defensive sense, and eventually just pass to the counterattack, usually breaking the line because they didn't have enough collective training for doing it if the enemy broke and this stuff. But in this sense, people set in the front line, they also needed to direct these advances, these marches, and there was all a spirit connected to it, of traditions, of songs, of chants, of prayers as well, right? Much of this music was also religious, as we can imagine, but of course more profane topics, of course, were present there. Always bearing in mind that, of course, if you went to battle, you were devoted to your own saint, to your protector, right? It's widely unknown. Every guild had its own protector saint. The various troops had figures of, think about the military saints, just or also their protectors and on their shields or their flags or on their surcoat, and so on. So everything was imbued with this deep sense of spirituality, to which of course, think about the Teutonic knights that brought organans on the battlefield and playing them right during the battle, right? So this is very, very interesting. Other musicians, of course, could be entirely unarmored. Also, we don't actually know how this music was practically performed, how many people were deputed to this. We know, as we'll read after, this is a quote that I took from my master thesis of the Battle of Markfeld. Actually, we see that that was a 13th century Austrian battle. There was enough of that, musical organization for the battle in a very also collective fashion. It was a great tympanum that guided alone the same army during the during the deployment, for how big it was, like this boom, boom, and that sound, this is what I would like to make you understand, that sound brought up, right, those forces of the underground, right, in this sense of trance, of Dionysiac excesses that had to bring people to meet with their death, right, in this necessarily spiritual sense. Musicians could also be naturally armed, but probably this time carrying not much more than a sword or dagger, right? Sometimes, as we've seen, also being disarmed. There were many other musical instruments, right? The same trumpets, actually, and as you understand, there could be of various types and sizes. There were horns, pipes, including bagpipes, drums, tambours or tabor, also the nakers, right, were very frequent. We have some quotes from later times. We have from Chaucer, for example, reference to pipes, trumps, knackers, and clarions. I don't know how to say it in 14th century English, that in the bataille blew bloody sounds, right? And this is kind of unintelligible, for me at least. And also we know of Battle of Halidon-Hill, English minstrels. The figure of minstrel, as we will see here with the Jongleur later, is particularly important in this regard. Who bait their tabors and blowmen, their trumps and pipers peepedane loud. Right. So, yeah, as we've seen, we've seen these basic functions that worked for which the trumpets were played, breaking camp, getting to arms, as we will see, getting on both on land and sea, or ordering to mount, to break camp, to advance, to rally, and so on, together with flag signals. The trumpets seem to have been largely brass, otherwise silver, and usually had banners and pennon cells hanging from them. We can see it mostly from later sources, but it was probably the same thing at the beginning, because also that had a specific meaning of spiritual, apotropaic function. Wasn't just a representative thing. And the trumpet's two principal variants were the clarion, a somewhat smaller and shriller instrument, and the buzin or buzin, right, from the Latin buccine. And the modern German word for trombone, Posaune, is a corruption of buzin, right, by way of buzin. The attention of the soldiers was first called by a shout of the tolling of a bell. Then there is this steirische Reimchronik, right, written at the time of Frederick the Fair of Habsburg, early 14th century, that I told you about before, that said about the Austrian army, actually the Austro-Hungarian army at the time, because they were Hungarian allies in the battle as well, and also Swabians, telling the truth, so it was a bit of a melange. And it says, "So groß war der Schall, Burg und Hersumperhall da genug, in dem Heereslug, auch war da viel groß, der Posaune das sich das gerottierte." Right, so strong was the sound. The sound of trumpets and drums was enough to make all the army resound. Right, Think about that. And furthermore, the tympanum was so large that it by itself guided the army. This is very interesting as well, because you have imagined literally, just from a visual point, think about this, who played this, how it was carried on the battlefield, and you understand that at that point you do understand that the world is not just, I mean, it's about mechanics, of course, but it's about why should we employ mechanics for what, and that's an intention that you have to be able to read. These people needed it as a great, trainer, right? As a great disciplining tool, right? To even say, wow, this is scary, properly. Think about, even at the distance, who knows how long it could be heard from. And the moment of the charge as well. We have said the importance of for knights to be launched at the sound of the trumpets, right? As you know, during this time, it's the peak of knightly, of feudal warfare, essentially. The knights advanced slowly for, most of the battlefields were very extended, in depth proper, right? We're talking even of kilometers, multiple kilometers. So it took a while before this lines actually departed from the major army, went to meet in the middle of the field. They went at pace, not to exhaust themselves. Then eventually, the last 100 meters, they increased their at a trot usually, and they began to shout, like, put the helmets on, all this stuff, get prepared. So they would also, because by about the 13th century, as we were saying before, even fighting with the great helm on took away of a lot of breath, right? So they tended to wear it at the last moment. And just in the last 100 meters, the signal to charge was given, right? And that was given with a trumpet, right? And that's when the knights sport, and they launched themselves at not full gallop, because otherwise they would have lost the cohesion, but properly at, if not at the last moments, but it was usually canter, something like 45 kilometers per hour. That you think it's few. That think it having just one knight charging at you, right? 45 kilometers per hour, right? Hundreds and hundreds of kilos, right? Launched that speed. You know what happens to your body if it finds you in the way, right? You don't wanna experience that. And also, trumpets were equally sounded in this manner during the charge at tournaments that only by the 14th century, actually, they were starting to take, according to the model of the Italian joust, this idea of, that there is a fence in the middle, right? Eventually that became like the most stereotypically late medieval thing of the tournament, but the classical medieval tournament wasn't anything like that, right? It was actually a battle, right? Not like a battle. It was actually a battle in which people killed themselves and destroyed everything was around. The unfortunate field they took could be inhabited by peasants. They would do a mess in that regard. It was exactly the same identical thing. So in this sense, it was just about proclaiming who you were. And in many ways, what does this remember you? Right? The soldiers shouted their war cry to frighten the enemy, to bolster up their own courage before the charge. Right? And in many ways, in more static combats, here we have a warfare centered on cavalry. So that was also to give a collective boost. But the idea that survived a bit in tournament is this idea of heroic warfare, right? Of single combat, which is the chivalric ideal that in practice never existed. It was never actually in the entire history of mankind a moment in which properly heroic warfare existed the way it was stereotypically meant to be, like an individual combat. Like there were duels in front of the lines, yes, but they were extremely rare, and generally speaking, if that ever happened on the battlefield, it was like you always had someone fighting alongside you, a squire, a retainer, or simply other knights. Right? So this is how it always happened, even in Homeric times, and in any other tribal, in any other context of that kind. So the interesting aspect of this is that, of course, the the trumpet in many ways was the substitute now on a collective scale of the presentation of the individual fighters, conceptually speaking. Of course, that role was replaced by the banner. I mean, about the banner, we should make some kind of video in the sense of, you know, showing what is the banner actually, what's the difference with the various flags, the pennants, and so on. It's quite important. It emerges actually from different areas of Europe, from different levels of military development in many ways, and there is a lot of, can't say properly totemic, but properly identitarily associated in a kind of proto-heraldic way, right? In the sense that the warrior, the tribal warrior, went out there before the battle shouting what? Actually singing his own deeds and the one of his lineage, right? And calling the gods to be witness of his deeds on the field. It was all a very meticulous thing, actually. It wasn't a typical, of course it was done in a way of even of scaring the enemy and saying, you know, I'm this and that, and if I get there, I kill you, right? I rip you apart. But still was done with all these magic spells, and it was in song. Figure, what did the bards do at the time, right? You know, the bards were to sing the deeds that would be associated to that specific hero, to that specific warrior and his clan, and all this stuff. So the Jongleur that we will start seeing in a while, for example, are in many ways the same figure, right? There's been a split proper between the warrior and that figure that sings for him his deeds, right? But we cannot fully know how it proceeded also in previous centuries. So the trumpet and the blason that eventually defines basically the heraldic insignia in many ways of the guy was derived from the blason, from the fact that it was announced by the trumpet, because that's what the blason from the boson, the buccino actually was, right? This is particularly important to stress because you get from there that the sound was originally to define the warrior even more than the appearance or any symbol, any flag or thing like that, right? And during the medieval times, this thing gets separated fundamentally. The reason being, of course, of the increasing collective training. The idea that now it's not just an individual guy that goes out there to sing that because he has to prove his individual skill as a warrior, but at this point, cohesion of a convoi of knights is fundamental, right? The single most important thing is that everybody remains in line during the charges. Nobody that has his nerves broken and starts, you know, spurring his horse, running in front of everybody and breaking the formation and going to get killed actually at that point and endangering the whole unit in that sense. There's a fierce discipline, right, that was imposed in the most brutal way ever since these were kids, right? They were beaten, abused, traumatized in the most violent ways to make them become knights. You know, it was something, in fact, you don't want to leave. And we know also from a psychological point of view, these people were traumatized. They had something seriously not working in their head, right? But that was the only way to do what was required to do on the battlefield. Don't ever think, even for a single instant, that a World War II battlefield was more traumatizing than a 13th century one, right? Because ask the veterans of the Red Army that figured in the movie Waterloo, with that Western Soviet co-production, the beautiful movie actually with Roter Steiger, and so on, that found themselves in front of a cavalry charge, right? Those people were attacking Nazi panzers barehanded under mortar fire on the Eastern Front. They couldn't maintain the line in front of a fake cavalry charge. I think a normal human being would never want to rationalize what it is to actually experience a cavalry charge against them. And this gives you the idea of the massive gaps that actually even just, you know, those infantries that took the chance, because it happened in these centuries as well, had, right, in spite of their lack of professionalism, and that tells you a lot about the moral forces of of the past, right? That are not at all inferior to our own. If anything, it's true the exact contrary, right? Um, we know in many contexts in the Battle of Arsuf, Bouvines, Courtrai, Mons-enPévèle, of trumpets frequently mentioned by the accounts. And at one point, their mention was so general that aside from sounding rhetorical, but if it is repeated mechanically speaking, it's not just rhetorical. It's evidently that everybody knew what it meant, right? And without any further explanation, it would have seemed superfluous because everybody knew what the minutiae of war actually were at the time. So that when you read these sources, never think that what is written is lacking, as these people were kind of underdeveloped because they didn't tell details about warfare. You should understand that everybody knew about them, so it was useless to write them in a chronicle to explain it to others, right? Some are stilized, and in a sense, of course, the horn, the trumpet has all its own place, and there is a deep symbolism. Think about Jericho, right? So that is something you find especially in the ecclesiastical chronicles, but there is not just ecclesiastical chronicles. Actually, that's a very northwestern European bias to think that the whole thing is basically what the world medieval warfare is, something like the War of the Roses or the 100 Years' War. It's not specifically that. That's very important too, because it tells you the importance of the clergy in those specific contexts, but elsewhere it's not like that. And even in those contexts, there is way more than just that, and chronicles are of dramatic importance, right? As you know, I love Anglo-Saxon historiography in many ways, but never let you be fooled by it for thinking of this nonsensical prejudice towards the idea that chronicles are unreliable for describing medieval warfare, because that's absolutely wrong, right? Chroniclers usually, right, especially when they are in fact not from a highly just hierarchized context, like from the Kingdom of England. It was one of the most unitary and functional kingdoms out there, no doubt, right? But look at communal, look at the Flanders, look at even at Germany, at France, at Italy. There is a lot of that, of secular sources written by middle-class people who had seen these things actually firsthand, that participated in the battles, and did give you pretty astonishing details that, aside from them, because even what they didn't say had a meaning, and what you should look at is what they say centrally. What's the core of the concept that the author wanted you to understand, right? So if they start talking about tactical details, it's not because you should be interested in the detail per se, but in the overall meaning that this had in the narrative, right? And always try to see how much they are actually interested in the moral balance of the clash. You would say, well, I don't care about that. Who was feeling better? That's all what warfare is, right? Warfare is not how you handle a weapon. Warfare is how much hatred you have towards the person that is in front of you. Don't let me bought by war games, by this utter obsession towards weapons. Like half of stuff, it derives even from interesting stuff like HEMA, etc. But there is no weapons are literally some of the least important thing in warfare in absolute terms, right? Never think it's about the technology. Never think about it's even the technique of the individual soldier. That's literally the least uninteresting, by the way, thing about warfare at the time. Study duels, study judicial duels, right? Do not think tactics is about that. Tactics is a matter of moral forces primarily, like entire warfare is, and that is true even for duels. There is no technique that wins. So of course these people do not give a damn about that, and they don't tell you. And of course we should be listening to them and being extremely grateful for what they write and for what they do not write, because that comparison makes us understand really what did matter in their mind, and they surely knew much more than we do about that war. Of course, if they were competent sources, they weren't just stylizing them after, a biblical passage or something else. And that is a problem for most of medieval warfare, actually. But in these centuries where we start seeing actually more, we start having an enormous amount of information that we should be very, very careful about from these narratives that are very spot on most of the times. We know at the Battle of Worringen in 1288, the trumpets sounding to call to arms, take arms before the battle, then they sounded again to start the attack, just as in the tournament. And when the Duke of Brabant's standard was brought down, however, the trumpeters were so distraught over the outcome of the struggle that they stopped blowing the trumpets, which shook the soldiers' morale. Ever thought about it? When you see the banner falling, like in this case, where's order? The banner was everything. The standard actually was everything. In this sense, where's the standard? We lose orientation on the battlefield, right? It's a dramatic problem. The musicians start saying, but how do we have to do it? We're still thinking to get themselves in safety, in a way. And it's a matter of morale. You see here the source, how stresses that. It's a moral problem, and that's what we should be interested in. Not when, what, precisely, mechanically. What's important here? The banner falls. The musicians stop sounding. This tells us way more than most of other information about whichever tactic was employed in here. It tells us that this thing sounded as long as the fight went on and things were going well. And if you stopped hearing that, you said, here, our command is collapsing. This is of enormous importance. At the Battle of Lewes, Henry the Third of England, 1264, right? According to a source, having realized that the rebel barons had appeared suddenly, awoke the more swiftly to put on their arms, the arms of the king's troops, and having drawn up their battle lines for fighting, spread their banners, one with a royal device threatening that, which was called the dragon, which is a pretty important also pagan reminiscence in Christian warfare, actually, and there's plenty of that. We've seen it at the Battle of Bouvines, and in that sense it was a specific international shout-out against the papacy that had excommunicated Otto of Brunswick, and the dragon embodied that. You see how many meaning existed in that sense. And the dragon was coupled, the dragon standard was made at advancing, threatening death proper, here it says. Imagine you see this, you would think, what's the banner like? Who cares? Here the point is that it's made advancing and letting people know that the dragon would kill you. And advance with a monstrous, great noise of trumpets. So do you see what it means? The dragon advances with a monstrous, great noise of trumpets. The trumpets are the dragon's roar, right? That's the point. And it's frightening. There is a lot of, these are kind of the more, in fact, you see the secular details how are actually spot on. There are others full, and for example, history is full of these chronicles that refer, for example, by the means used by Joshua to take Jericho, right, at the end of the 13th century BC, right? The walls came tumbling down, probably more from a mine at that point, but it was believed that happened because of the sound of divine trumpets. And this is not even to be discarded either, because this might have been just a religious chronicler writing that, referring to the biblical reference, but the idea that there is a divine trumpet that sounds from your side is something that people really believed. Of course, in a different way, maybe from the clergyman who wrote this, monastic environment far away from the battlefield, but don't think that that's even so true, because monks actually traveled far and wide, even as dignitaries, as diplomats, as even on battlefields, seeing the horrors of that. thinking that God was from your side, right? All the Carolingian imperial propaganda is based largely on the Jewish military culture of the Old Testament. Largely. Charlemagne was obsessed with the Old Testament. He was convinced to be a new David himself. And that was the point. You crush your enemies because God is from your side, and your trumpets are the ones that are warning about the arrival of God, Lord of battles. And the Carolingian knights are the saints of the Lord, as the Old Testament says. If one doesn't understand that these people actually believed in it, in a magical sense, still, this is nothing to do with the actual understanding, whatever context the Bible was written, but the Frankish mindset of the 8th century believed that this was a spell, a magical spell. You could make it, right? If you were faithful to that word, to that promise, you would have God on your side for real. It was a very pragmatic negotiation, exchanges we were explaining in the other video today. These people truly believed it, as many other things of pagan relics that exist at the same time of Christianization. One cannot understand military history in the very in the most historically accurate way if he has, I don't know, properly read even just the Bible. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any single sense. How many people have watched Vikings without knowing much about Viking history, or Outlaw King without having ever read anything historical specifically about, I don't know, 13th, 14th century Scotland, right? And that's a problem we still have, because you see, we have detached ourselves from the need of feeling a complete experience, which in these worlds was all what life was about. And there was a continuous research for knowledge and this kind of values. And this is not primitive. It is actually what allowed us to get to the point we are now, right? Because of course this thing went on, eventually the disowning itself, as we have seen with the Enlightenment and the thing, but at the same time it was not erased, right? It's still within us, right? Like other aspects, like the same process of desecularization, that once again it has its pros and cons, but one must be aware of that, because the consequence, if you ignore this, is that you will not understand properly the world you live in. You will just do mistakes that will create problems to yourself and other people. This is the great problem of human existence. And the same happened in these times, but at least there was a different, if you want, the world was more logical at the time than it is today in the human perception. We know, as we were saying before, that other than the army's commander and his marshals, the only men permitted to ride before the banners, for at least the beginning of this period, was another, let's say, musician, the Jongleur, right, who preceded armies going to battle in the earlier part of this period. And definitely of these, the best known one definitely is Taillefer, right, who rode before the Normans at Hastings. And the Jongleurs were, as you know, responsible for boosting the army's morale with stirring words and martial songs, or even juggling with their swords in the face of the enemy. So these were skills that, you understand, mixed both a musical, a poetical, and a military ability. What about the Druids? What about the Skulls? These were the same people, right? They were coming from times in which the three things were all together. A great Celtic warrior, 1st century BC Gaul, let's say, would have been a Druid, right? It is not what you see in Asterix, where there is, the old, weak guy that just collects herbs and some. These were actually pretty brutal warriors on their own. And they composed their own deeds of the battles that had happened, and those who had already happened. And they kept memory of all these tricks, of these fighting techniques as well. Druids were experts also in this stuff. So the Jongleur in a 11th century Western Frankish context is actually just a relic of this. The last reference to a Jongleur in a military context dates to 1100 basically. So from that on, you find just maybe the minstrel, an entertaining figure that sometimes, however, in certain specific contexts are also to be considered as wise people, because indeed they had to be funny but entertaining, but also clever in this regard. I mean, they had people who work with their mind. Well, the warrior was meant to do that, especially the chieftain, especially the leader of men. So the same people that worked to chant their own deeds in front of the enemy, not so many centuries before the ones we're talking about. So these people were expert, even presumably in playing musical instruments, right? But let's get to some other more prosaic, some more secular example, just to understand what throughout this century, what maybe the trumpet was about. And it's not a surprise in this sense that in feudal Europe, knights were famously also pretty well versed artists, right? This is something everybody knows. These were people who wouldn't, have any problem to cut a person alive to pieces, including innocent, women or children. And we do know that this happened on a regular basis, but that were extremely artistically versed. Always remember, by the way, that we know pretty well from a psychological, biological point of view that the peak of male violence coincides in his mature years, in his early 20s, fundamentally, with the peak of his creativity. Always remember that, right? In a society that says, that rightfully condemns violence of a certain type, but, think about what this means, right? Creativity as well, sure. A poet knight like Bertrand de Born, right, feeling the approach of a new war, he wrote towards the end of the 12th century, trumpets, drums, banners and pennons, standards, and white and black horses. This is what we will see in a while, and they will be beautiful times, because we will take away goods from the usurers, right, and from the streets pack animals, and the bourgeois will never be safe, will never be without fear, nor the merchant that comes from France, right, but rich will be he who will take great heart. Ah, la guerre, que jolie. This is the spirit of a 12th century knight. War is beautiful, is a payback to destroy all those injustices. Look at what the person he dislikes, the usurers of these pack animals used by peasantry and so on, the bourgeois, the merchant. All these people were considered cowards by the knights, and the only rich person, he says, will be the one who will show great courage. And this was not anecdotal or metaphorical, because objectively the knight fought for the same wealth, right? That was displayed at that time still because of individual acts of courage. The path to collective discipline was very long. But here the point is more evidently the fact of these trumpets, tambours, flags and pennons, standards, and black and white horses. This is what we will see, and they will be beautiful times. These people got excited with war. I mean, you may think this is sick, and yeah, it is, right? It is exactly what we're telling about before. These people were freaking, psychiatric cases. But this is what warfare was functionalized like. Because once again, what had to happen there required these people. And this person was a poet. Violence and creativity. Think about that. Think about war in the path of civilization. When a knight entered the lists at a tournament, he was announced by the sounding of a trumpet, as we've seen, and the calling out of his coat of arms. Right? This was started. Right? You know that heraldry is something more pertaining to the modern age than the Middle Ages. Right? It's something that began to crystallize just towards the end of it. Otherwise, the thing was pretty fluid because actually every knight had considered himself like a single individual, right? The dynastization of great houses was something fairly, I can say rare, but it was in fact very elitistic. And still, it was susceptible because of the general political and social instability, also connected to wars, of course, and extinction of houses, of the, so the marriage and all this stuff, life was dramatically short and fragile at the time, way more than it is today. So the thing had remained very fluid, but properly and eventually the principal terms and order of description employed in blason were in existence, first of all, by the early 13th century, and by this date, heralds were finding it necessary for the first time to describe a coat of arms in such a way that there could be no shadow of doubt as to what and whose it was, right? Because by the 13th century, a more stable system was forming, right? And therefore, the heralds readily understood that kind of a more standardized language had to be spread all over Europe. So the fact that the blason, the sound of the trumpet, was connected to this means that still the trumpet embodied the in an acoustic way, properly the identity of the guy, because it was shown together with his own insignia. They were starting being just outlined in a stable fashion at the time. The language of the early blason was French or Latin, of course, but it would be later replaced by the language of each nation. In English heraldry, for example, the language of blason has become anglicized except for a few technical terms, right? Others were communal. Poland was deeply influenced by Germany, for example. Other countries started kind of creating on their own as well. There are interesting differences also between the various countries. As we were saying before, the Christian knights met with the Islamic military tradition in the Near East, in Spain. The armies of Islam also included bands of musicians, as we were saying before, playing drums, oboes, flutes, and trumpets. There was a great emphasis actually put on drums, especially. First and foremost, right? It was a terrifying sight. There were thousands of them playing at the same time. Every soldier, in a way, used it because it was considered a prerogative of the warrior, right? Of being able to awaken, having this connection with the chthonic force, after all, but also, not just with that, right? With these other instruments, including trumpets, as we've seen, were connected also with the Apollonic side of the story. For them, it was a matter of ordering for maneuver. It was a lot of especially during Crusades, as you know, a lot of Turkic influence from the steppes that had this much closer connection with the, in fact, with this shamanic tradition of, especially of, musical instruments attached to military practice. We had a greater coordination between cavalry that had a lot, of which there was a lot, and operating in great coordination on the field. So it was a slightly different military tradition from the Christian one that produced fear and chaos among Christian ranks, because it was like a storm proper. They wanted to be that had to be represented on the field. These horse archers coming and going in swarms, like clouds and thunders, attacking, making these sounds and shouting, making war cries. the same Crusader horses were usually not accustomed to such noise, right? But there were some interesting adaptations. For example, we know that in 1098, Raymond of Saint-Gilles, right, during the First Crusade, had built a high and tall timber castle put on 4 wheels, right, over which many knights had mounted, such as Everard the Hunter, that played strongly his own trumpet. It's very interesting. Here it's a sort of carroccio that we will be seeing in a while in the Italian communal military tradition. But here it's very fascinating that the loud sound of the trumpet is connected to a hunter, right? You know that hunting was the aristocratic sport by definition. It was the one that every nobleman of these ones participating to the crusades would be skilled in. And warfare in ancient times, including among the same Seljuks, for example, that the Crusaders were fighting, etc., was obviously the same thing. This big hunting parties on horseback, a training for war, right? It was done. Look at the Achaemenid tradition. It all stemmed from there, and it all stemmed from this sense of, once again, the Indo-European and also not only but a Eurasian tradition, the steps of these great armies swarming over the land and sucking dry the whole thing and dominating, ruling over it. There was a lot of it. And here it's interesting, this episode during the crusade, which could be like a mobile fortress over which probably many knights, so the elite, has mounted. So it was probably a kind of a mobile tower in the battle. This is very fascinating, and from it emanated this terrible sound of the trumpet as well, that had to evoke evidently this might and power. We know that in the Iberian Reconquista, the Christian knights faced frequently black troops, sub-Saharan African troops, that in order to impress or demoralize the enemy were commonly playing with drums, trumpets, and cymbals, but also their soldiers would bawl out shrill and savage war cries. Right, they were designed exactly to devastate the enemy, psychologically speaking. This naturally stems for probably more tribal contexts, for which these usually mercenaries came from. These were sub-Saharan troops were usually brought in the context of the Reconquista from the Almohads or the Almoravids, right, from the lands of think about the Senegal, all of these areas south of the properly of the Atlas Mountains and south of the Sahara, that were often in fact brought, even in very consistent numbers, in the north to serve as troops and settling even in the various lands ruled by the Muslims. This is fascinating because actually these troops were to be found from the opposite side of Africa. For example, there were lots of Sudanese troops usually in the Ayyubid armies, for example, so Fatimid armies, and we know they also we made it for the, I think we observed it for the third battle of Ramla, right? These were tough troops, right? They resisted even against cavalry charges, which is rare for an infantry at the time to happen. And you have to think in this sense that moral boost we're talking about before was necessary for these guys, not just to scare the enemy, it probably also boost their own moral in the process. There is a lot of interesting information from Italian warfare in these centuries about trumpets and their employment. First of all, remember the chariot of Raymond of Saint-Gilles during the First Crusade. Well, this is awfully close in many ways to the Italian carroccio of the Italian communes. The carroccio was essentially this wagon over which usually the cross, the symbol of the, usually it's thought to have been the symbol of the city, of the municipality, but actually was the symbol of the people, right? And we will see here also what the difference was, because it brought usually a bell, and we've seen that the bell was actually one of the chthonic associated instruments. So the people fought on foot, they weren't the knights, although there were actually knights guarding the Carroccio as well. But it was in fact a mix, because also trumpets were carried over the Carroccio. So there is, in that sense, a bit the municipal feeling of the knights and the people, let's say, uniting under the same flag, right? Even though, at least in later times, it was mostly like a popular symbol, but still, especially during the 12th century, it was shared in this regard. Very famously, we made a video on the Battle of Legnano in 1176. The climatic moments of the battle revolved around the resistance of the Milanese infantry around the Carroccio, resisting to the imperial charges of German cavalry that didn't make the breakthrough, at least before the other Lombard cavalry intervened from the rear, from the flank. And the Carroccio on campaign served as a combined observation and command post, right? Do not underestimate, in this sense, even things like the sight. Think about how precarious communications were in general. So even just the line of horizon was a very important thing to scope effectively. It was obviously evident. It was a rallying point, mostly. But it was also, for example, a field chapel, right? There were highly important religious symbols. Like, you couldn't lose the Carroccio in battle, because that was the symbol of the city. It was a huge loss, dishonor to let it take from the enemy. And if that happened, it's because the army would have been annihilated. And in fact, the Carroccio itself carried an altar where priests performed services before battle and also prayed during the battle, right? The standards of the city and of its patron saint were all together with them. And there was a number of trumpeters, in fact. And as we were saying before, often this superstructure with one or more bells to transmit also the commander's orders. And that was also, in fact, a bit the symbol of the city, right? It's as if the bell tower of the city had been there itself. So there are other examples of trumpets used in this context. For example, in May 1241, a clash of the Pavese against the Milanese brought to the victory of the first, who had triumphantly won by taking the trumpets and the buccine and the flags and the keys of the communal gonfalon of the Milanese, right? Because the Carroccio was not there. So basically, that occasion, the Milanese had brought all this stuff, with their camp somewhere else, and all these symbols that were used eventually to boost the morale were taken by the Pavese. And among these symbols were the trumpets, right? You would say, wow, I got the keys and the banner of the commune. So yeah, that's it, right? But it was important that the musical instruments had been taken as well, because evidently something in them was connected to the very voice of the city. There was something spiritual connected to those instruments in the first place. And right, and together with these trophies were also 350 chosen Milanese knights taken as prisoners, aside from the killed, right? So this was a massive Milanese defeat at the hands of the Pavese, and it's important for the Pavese to state that we got their trumpets as well. And there are a lot of provocations in Italian warfare as well between these cities that actually are just a few tenths of kilometers away from one another, but hate each other's guts. In this seasonal, well, not seasonal now, it would turn into professional by the late 13th century. There's an example, 1295. Now there is a challenge that is launched by the Milanese and their allies. At this point, Milan has a lot of cities under his control, right? To a Cremonese army that was closed in the city of Lodi. So lots of alliances here, of leagues, of connections. So the Milanese approached up to, here it says, the distance of 4 crossbow shots and even up to the ditches of Lodi, playing the trumpets and shouting, "Come out, Cremonese panders! Come out, charlatans, and come here to fight!" Right? But the Cremonese do not come out. The Milanese remain in front of Lodi up to midday, and then they went away safe, while the Cremonese, in turn, as the Parmesan chronicler that tells the story bitterly remarks, secretly and shamefully retreated. So the point here is that the Milanese had challenged the Cremonese to combat via the trumpets. The guys had not showed up, so these were cowards, right? And the Milanese could say that that was a victory, essentially. And the Cremonese go away in shame, right? It was a great importance in terms of the reputation of the wall military action as such. Playing the trumpet in this sense was to say, we are here, ready to fight. Remember, the idea of the warrior that presents itself and says, come here, coward. And they shouted, the Milanese, as we've seen, they shouted to the Cremonese from outside the city walls and said, come out. Right? And they wouldn't. This is very fascinating. In May 1297, Maginardo of Susinana, that was a nobleman of the Apennine, Romagnol Apennine, was captain of the people of the city of Faenza at this time, marched with his troops from Imola, where there is the Ferrari and the Formula 1 circuit today, towards Castle St. Peter, where the Bolognese army was. There are the clashes between the Ghibellines and the Welfs in this case, and here Maginardo brought his army, basically sending messengers to the enemy to tell them that he was ready to come to battle. But the Bolognese wholly refuted. The Chronicle says, so Maginardo sent trumpeters and tambourines, drummers, up to the Silaro River where the Bolognese were encamped, and at sunset also brought his own camp there. So, having made things in this way, the chronicler says the aforementioned Romagnols retreated their ranks magnificently and with cunning, coming back to Imola, and this happened with great insult and shame of the Bolognese. What does this mean? Even in here, the Ghibellines had sent out trumpeters and drummers to say, we are ready to fight. They even brought their own camp in front of one of the Bolognese. For the whole day, the Bolognese do nothing. This is a virtually full and undebatable victory. Right? This is a moral. You see the moral side of the story in war, how much it matters, right? There are other episodes that are interesting. For example, always from northern Italy, in 1248, the communal army of Bergamo, in order to bring support to Pontoglio that was besieged by the enemy, they could support the town just with the sound of the trumpets and the waving of the flags, because basically they, as the chronicler mockingly concludes telling the story, meaning that they hadn't been able to do anything. So they had showed, yes, we're playing, we are here, but eventually they didn't do anything about it anyway. Alright, so I think these were interesting examples to see what, even just in the practice of warfare, trumpets were used like, actively speaking. And we'll talk also about trumpeters and other military musicians in for what concerns the 14th and the 15th century. And we will talk about military music also too, because I think it's really an overlooked topic that deserves a lot of attention instead. And for now, however, we stop here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.